Thanks for coming. I'll introduce myself a little bit. After I graduated from college, my first job was at Microsoft. I worked on Microsoft Excel on programmability. I did a few other jobs after that. I moved to New York City. In the year 2000, which is about 12 years ago, I couldn't find any product companies in New York City. And I really knew that as a software engineer, as a software developer, I wanted to work for a company where I was working on the product, not just working on keeping the company operating. So I had to start my own, and that was Fog Creek Software, which I started in 2000. And we've made a lot of products. Our big one now is Trello. In 2008, with Jeff Atwood, I created Stack Overflow. The idea there was to sort of consolidate and improve the way that programmers get answers to their questions on the internet. You're kind of young to remember this, but there was a site called Experts Exchange, which everybody, and before Stack Overflow, if you typed a programming question into Google, the result would be at Experts Exchange, and it would show you the answer, and it would show you like the first 2 lines, and then it would blur out the rest of it, and you had to pay to become a member. And this was considered by many to be extremely evil. Experts Exchange had actually generated all that content from programmers who had volunteered their time to answer people's questions on the internet, and then they turned around and started charging for that same material, which programmers thought was manifestly unfair. And I just noticed that for several years nobody was fixing this problem, and it should be very easy, given that programmers are happy to answer questions on the internet, to gather all that energy into something that doesn't create personal private wealth, but actually benefits the world of programmers. So that's why I created with Jeff Atwood Stack Overflow. And what I'm going to talk about today is anthropology, specifically the cultural anthropology of Stack Exchange. One thing you should know, when I went to college, I went to Yale, and they had a requirement that when you if you studied an engineering field or a scientific field, you also had to take a certain number of classes in softer sciences, let's call them sciences, like history, not really a science, economics, anthropology, English. And so one of the classes that I took to fulfill this requirement was cultural anthropology, and there was a lot of studying of Indian tribes who exchange blankets on holidays, and none of it made any sense to me, and it was all very silly, and I found it to be extraordinarily boring, and I thought that it was probably the most useless class that I would ever take in college. And for 20 years that was true, but after 20 years, when I started actually trying to create online communities, I realized that I actually kind of remembered a few things from this class that I had taken, and it turns out to be, now when I look at anthropology, I think it's actually the most important thing if you want to create a site like Stack Overflow. We have, just to give you an idea of the size, 444 million page views that we had in February. So right now we're the 71st largest website in the United States, and usually higher in most other countries. We're higher ranked than other countries. We have 38 million people that come visit Stack Exchange every month. 38 million people, if you thought of that in terms of like how big of a country would that be, is somewhere between Poland and Algeria. Those are countries, right? Yeah. Bigger than Canada, I like to say. That's a good one. We'd be the largest United States. And actually, when you think about studying groups of people, that's exactly what cultural anthropology is about. It gets to the point where it's no longer bits and bytes and algorithms or anything to do with engineering. It's entirely anthropology. So I found my studies of anthropology to be remarkably useful, and I'm going to talk specifically about some of the decisions that we made which all led to be critical success factors in creating Stack Overflow. Without them, we would not have succeeded. And how they applied. So the first thing to know is that there's something utopian about this. This is a picture of the Burning Man Festival, actually, and that's a unicorn, which is our mascot. When you're trying to create sort of a utopian society, it's a little bit crazy. It's sort of a very dangerous ambition to have. But you better be careful if you're going to do it. Now, quick introduction to put this into perspective. When people start, every good slideshow has to show an old computer. It's an IBM System 360 mainframe computer. And kind of the original, when computer science and software engineering were invented, it was thought that your goal is you've got this computer that computes things, and you need to get it to calculate something for you. And when it did, you were done. That was what the computer did. It calculated things. And you were very lucky if you could get, let's say you had to do payroll once a week. If you could run the payroll in less than 7 days and get it debugged and running and actually producing money for people in their bank accounts that work for you once a week, that was considered to be exceptionally good. And that was really the only kind of thing you did with computers, is you computed and you calculated. At some point, time sharing was invented. And time sharing was this concept that you take one of these $5 million computers that's in the room, that's in a basement, and you connect it via some kind of telephone line to a whole bunch of individual little terminals. And when I started programming, this is what we used when I was 12. And you had a little keyboard there, as you can see, and everything was printed because they had not yet invented the CRT monitor, I guess. Multiple people were able to sort of use the same computer. And for the first time, it was conceivable that you could use this as a communication device because you were all connected to the same computer. But the only people you could communicate with were the other people in the computer lab who were sitting right next to you. So you generally didn't. And these devices, because they had that little printing, it was a dot matrix printer. The dot matrix printer is kind of slow, and it can't print very fast. So it can't really even print fast enough to print large blocks of text. So it never occurred to people that you would use computers for strings. I mean, if you go and look at the Fortran programming language, it has terrible, terrible, terrible string processing. You could barely sort of do the occasional output format with strings, but you couldn't really manipulate blocks of strings because it never occurred to anybody that you use computers to process a human language other than just numbers. Now, when these terminals came out, this is the digital VT100, it was very popular. They were called smart terminals. They were kind of dumb. They were called smart terminals because they had the ability to move the cursor. That was the definition of a smart terminal. Because as soon as you can move the cursor, you could create full screen applications like editors, and Emacs is an early example of that you've probably used, or VI. And the interesting thing about these CRTs is that they were blazingly fast. And so they could actually print text faster than you could read. And because all of a sudden they could print large amounts of text quickly, this became a useful communications device. And the very first email applications were invented. And you could actually compose a text email and send it to somebody, and they would read it. And this is the first time people were using computers to mediate between human beings. And the original email format, actually, that was invented sort of way back then, is exactly the same format we still use for email now. I mean, there's a little bit of rich formatting, but the headers are exactly the same. Everything kind of works the way it was invented then, and nothing has really fundamentally changed about email since then. And once email was invented, people started creating these mailing lists where you had 27 people that were all interested in, I don't know, it was the 70s, so probably growing marijuana. But let's say 27 people that were all interested in artificial intelligence. And they would make a mailing list, and then whenever you had a question about artificial intelligence, you would send it to this mailing list, and all 27 or the other 26 people would all get it, and they could respond to you. And soon what happened is that everybody's inbox was cluttered with all these mailing lists. So the response to that was a program called Usenet, which, if you look closely at Usenet, this is an online forum discussion system almost entirely being used by people on Unix, but it didn't have to. How many people have used Usenet in this room? I'm just curious. A few of you. Usenet, if you look closely at it, it still has headers that look exactly like email headers. So it functions exactly like email, except that you only have to see the things that you haven't seen before, and it behaves a little bit like an online forum. One of the things I noticed about Usenet, what you see up in it's hard to see in the upper right-hand corner, that they eventually invented a threaded version of Usenet where anybody can reply to anybody. It made this awkward tree that you had to try to follow of who is responding to whom. And something that's interesting to notice, which I noticed in the days of Usenet, which led a lot of how I think about Stack Overflow about Usenet, was that there were some accidental design implementation details of Usenet that were not intentional, completely accidental, which influenced the society that was created on Usenet. And I'm just going to give you one example, but there are probably 10 or 20 important ones. But one example I'll give you is that the way that nobody had very large hard drives in these days. So like a university might have 10 megabytes of storage space total for the whole university. So if you wanted to participate in Usenet, where you have thousands of people all over the world typing into this forum, and the message is being copied, it wasn't client-server, that hadn't been invented yet, and the internet wasn't fast enough. So Usenet was a store and forward system where everybody who participated in Usenet had a copy of all messages. And combining that with the fact that there were a lot of messages and that they were lucky if they had 10 megabytes of disk space, that meant that you couldn't store an archive. You couldn't keep all the old messages. You could only keep 5 or 6 days worth of Usenet on your hard drive before you just had to delete it and throw it away. And that meant that if somebody wrote something, if one of you guys wrote something on Usenet and I wanted to respond to you, the other people reading it might not have your original message. They wouldn't have the original message that was being replied to. And so on Usenet, people would quote the original message in line because they couldn't assume that anybody else was going to have that original message. And the way that worked is with these little greater than signs, which were very common. You still see them in email being sent by old people. And the reason that they were greater than signs is if you went into the Usenet reader, RN, and you typed R for reply, it would take the messages you were replying to, and it would insert greater than at the beginning of every line, and then it would allow you to, and then it would throw you in the editor to respond in any way you saw fit, and you would usually add your stuff at the bottom. And one thing that people started doing, which you can see here, is that they would intersperse their responses in between the messages. So because you had, you brought in the original message, it was all quoted, and you wanted to respond to it now, it became very easy in your editor just to go in and respond point by point. You could respond to every single sentence in the nastiest, snarkiest, nitpickiest way you could dream of. And so you would see these things where somebody wrote a long post about why Israel is good or Israel is bad. This was on talk.politics.mideast, where they just debated about whether Israel is good or bad forever. And every single line, every other line would be, this is nonsense, this is stupid, you're an idiot, you spelled this wrong, that's not true, this isn't true. You would simply respond to every single aspect of it. And the interesting point to notice here is that there was an accidental technical decision that was taken with the greater than and the editor because we didn't have enough hard disk space. And that led to a community of people that had a very specific style of arguing with each other by nitpicking every single sentence. Instead of sort of addressing the general thing, they would write a long post and then they would respond to every single thing in that post. And this obviously went on forever. In fact, the world's very first internet troll, which is famous, it's very hard to sort of detect, not a lot of people know about this, was on a Usenet news group called sock.college, and it was something about feminism, don't ask me what, I can't remember, where somebody, using their editor, made it look like they were replying to a reply to a reply to a reply using a lot of greater than signs. And they constructed an artificial backstory and then wrote that was absolutely absurd and made everybody very angry. And then said, well, I don't really think you really mean this. And they just sort of wrote that and posted it, and it looked to everybody else like there was some idiot there who had said something very stupid, although this person did not actually exist and was made up from whole cloth. So they, for the first time, somebody had actually faked the sort of predecessor message, and they created an epic argument on this news group that went on for like 12 years on sock.college. And years later, right, nobody could go back because nobody kept the old copies of everything. Years later, this company called Deja News, which was bought by Google, went and bought all the old Usenet archives, and they gathered everything from backup tapes that they could find. And somebody tried to reconstruct this, and they discovered what had happened. And they're like, this guy is not, nobody knew for 20 years that the original troller was not actually responding to somebody. He was creating, an artificial straw man to argue with that was not a real person. Nobody could possibly have thought what he said. So now we live in a world where millions of people are using computers all the time, and they're using computers primarily as communications devices. And so the important lesson that I learned and that you should learn is that when you make these little decisions, no matter how small they may seem, like using greater than to quote something, those decisions are very, very likely to influence how people behave. and they're likely to shape the way in which they walk and talk and interact with one another. And that's what I'm here to talk about, because at some point you have to stop making those things accidental. You have to start planning, like, all right, I want people to behave in this way. I'm going to build this kind of system, instead of having it just be a complete mistake. The same thing, you see it happen all the time in architecture and in public spaces. So you might have something that looks like that, and maybe it's intentional or maybe it's accidental, but it's a good place for a kid to go and skateboard, and so kids will show up and start skateboarding there. If you happen to build a table with little chairs on it, and the table happens to have an 8x8 grid on it, then old men will show up and play chess. There's the Spanish Steps in Rome, which you may have seen. This is an example of an accident. These are, in Rome, there are two roads, and they're on a hill. And if you built a road between them, it would be too steep, so they put steps there. But what has actually evolved is this has become a living room for Rome, and it's all full of backpackers and gypsies and American tourists who sit around and braid each other's hair on the steps, because it's perfect for that, even though it wasn't really built for that. And so you actually have a particular society that evolves as an accident of the way that the architects built that. And then you can try to copy that if you want. So in Times Square, they built some steps that don't go anywhere, hoping that the European backpackers and tourists and gypsies would show up and start braiding each other's hair. It hasn't really happened yet, but it might yet. And one example of that is when the web was invented, much later than Usenet, the web showed up, everybody sort of ported Usenet to the web, and they created these online forums. And there's software like PHPBB and vBulletin that you can use to get these online discussion groups that still have all the same mistakes as the original Usenet. And in many ways, they have not kind of invented anything new, and they have not added any new features to try to get better behavior in how you have a conversation than Usenet does, so they continue to exhibit all the same syndromes as Usenet did. So that's not us. We're sort of utopian. We're trying to build a brave new world, and when we set out to create Stack Overflow, we thought about a lot of little details, and we tried to think about how the design decisions that we were making would actually influence human beings, and how they would influence people, and how they would create a certain type of society on Stack Overflow. So I'm going to go into a bunch of these details to show you some examples of how we thought about this. The first thing I want to talk about is first impressions. What are the first things that you think of, the first things that you see, and the first things that you notice when you go to a site or to Stack Overflow or to anything? Every group and every society presents itself in a certain way. So if you have a group of people protesting, this was Occupy Wall Street, you all remember that? And there's a lot of little details going on here. Do I have a pointer? A lot of little details going on here in which this group is sort of projecting to the world what they're all about, and specifically who they want to join them and who they want to exclude deliberately. And so every human group is going to be doing this, often by accident. So they have some signs there that's saying that Wall Street is greedy, and this guy has a nice Zapata t-shirt. I don't know if he knows who that is. He has a very brightly colored keffiyeh, which is not because he's Palestinian, but because he is sympathetic. Here's a woman who hearts the 99%. She loves the 99%. If you look closely, she has very, very expensive headphones, which probably put her in the 1%, in my opinion. But she hasn't really thought about that. And they're, of course, on Wall Street. This is the New York Stock Exchange. So what's going on here is a group that, the closer you look, the more signals you see that they're trying to send out. And partially that's because they're protesting. But when you go to a website, you get the same exact thing. So when I called up Jeff Atwood and said, here's my idea for Stack Overflow, what do you think? He went around to all the other Q&A sites that were out there just to see what was going on. And I'll read you some of this. I know it's hard to see on the screen. But this is Yahoo Answers, which still exists. It's the #1 question and answer website. And it seems really terrible. I mean, these questions like, what is your favorite plant of all time and why? How to make a lava lamp? That's a good question, actually. All-time dumbass awards. This one I like. Can I die from carbon monoxide? I sort of wanted to go in there and say, oh no, not at all. Don't worry about that. But a couple of other questions here which give you some more clues. There's a question here that says, what are you listening to? And that's the first clue that this is not questions and answers the way that I thought of questions and answers. This is something else, right? This is chat. This is conversation. And the second clue is I keep forgetting to do my homework. And then you realize that these are 12-year-olds. That's why they're on here. They're on here having a chat room. And indeed, it turns out that Yahoo Answers, which appears to be a gigantic question and answer forum where people all over the world pose questions and other people answer them and they get help, is actually a chat room for 12-year-old girls. There are some boys here. It's mostly girls, and they mostly went here because Yahoo Answers got its start in the age of MySpace, and in the age of MySpace, there was a certain age of kids that didn't want to have a MySpace profile because they were sort of weird, scary adult stalkers who would follow them around. And they were looking for a system where they could have the same kind of social network as they had on MySpace without any permanent identity. And somehow they latched onto Yahoo Answers. So they would log on to Yahoo Answers, they'd make a new account every day, and they would just sort of randomly chat with people by saying, hey, what are you listening to? What's going on? And they would use it as a chat room. So reading this, you immediately can figure out this is either for me or not for me. You can tell by looking at the front page. Here's answers.com. This one I kind of like. What kind of attorney is needed for advice on getting someone you know committed to a mental institution? I think that's a good question. What is the rights of McDonald's? I don't know what that means. What is the rights of McDonald's? But rite, R-I-T-E, means like a ceremony, you know, like a religious rite. I don't know what that question is. What supplies do the U.S. get from Ghana? There's a question here. What are some examples of a welcome address for JS Prom? Nobody really knew what JS Prom is. A prom is at the end of high school. You have a prom. It's the last dance on the last day of high school. And I always ask people when I do this talk if they know what JS is, and nobody knew for years until I gave the talk in California. And somebody said in California they have this thing called the junior-senior prom, the JS Prom. It's specific to California. So you have here a kid that doesn't even realize that the internet includes the whole world, right? Like they have such a narrow perspective that they think that their problems are kind of global problems. And you know, once again, Answers.com is just an alternate chat room with more emphasis on homework. Amazon bought a company called Askville, which has a chat room, and they have some interesting questions like what is the 21st largest states, which I think you could find out from Google. How can I start making the right choices in my life? That's a good question. You can start by using Yahoo Answers instead of Askville. And then finally, there's a real question. Finally, what is the interval notation for 5x minus 4 is less than 3, 2x minus 1? Note, I believe it is a number greater than minus 17. But they refused to answer it. They said, oh, this is homework. You can't ask homework questions on here. So the one legit seeming question that even shows up on this site, nobody asked it. Here is Stack Overflow. You can go to Stack Overflow any time of day or night, and you'll immediately notice that no high school student is going to even understand what is happening here. And if you're a computer programmer, you immediately see words that remind you that this is a website for programmers. And you can see something about SQL and something about Android, something about Cake PHP, and you realize it's for all programmers. But the questions are all very, very advanced. So you realize that these are advanced programmers that participate here. And the good thing about that is that if you're an advanced programmer, you know that you come to the right place. The other good thing about that is you know that if you're not an advanced programmer, you should leave, which we like, which is something that not very many website owners aim for. They're always trying to figure out how to make the front page as welcoming as possible and to get as many people as possible into the fold. But they end up doing that by dumbing it down, which drives away the experts. You can go to some of our sites. You guys are all programmers, so when you go to Stack Overflow, you probably understand it. If you go to our Jewish learning site, you'll probably find that none of those questions, Baruch Hu or Kavanah, even make sense. You don't even understand what they're about. They appear to be written in English. They're actually in yeshiva English, which is mostly Hebrew and Yiddish. And it's all about arcane details of Jewish law, and it's very specific to very Orthodox Jews. And I only understand one of the questions. Cross-validated is an example. This is our site for statistics. Once again, you go there and you immediately see sort of advanced statistical questions that tell you that if you're a real statistician, you should go here. If you're a high school student with questions about homework, you shouldn't. Now, to be fair, some of these sites have more narrow silos. So Askville has a math section. This is the math section from Askville. Some of those questions are things like write an algorithm to find the number in between 7 and 100. Again, homework. The second one, apply for apartments online. That's spam, right? And you can't see this, but this was asked 13 hours ago. And so the only thing that tells me is that that question has been sitting there for 13 hours and nobody cares. Nobody cares enough to delete the spam. There's no process to get rid of spam. And what that says is this is abandoned. There's nobody that cares, nobody gives a shit about this place anymore. And if I ask a question, it's my question, even if it's good, is going to sit there for 13 hours without anybody looking at it. So this site is just about doing everything possible to drive away anybody that knows anything about math. We have two math sites on the Stack Overflow network. We have Math Overflow and the Math Stack Exchange. This is a Math Stack Exchange. But it's all full of very, very highly technical math questions. The rule is math.stackexchange.com, this one. You can ask any reasonable mathematics question, but they're all pretty advanced. They're sort of like college graduate level math questions, somebody who's studying mathematics. Math Overflow has an even stricter rule. It's only about research level mathematics. And their rule says if a typical math professor would know the answer to this question, it's not permitted. It's too easy. We're not here to answer questions that we know about. We're here to address topics in advanced mathematics research. And by creating a site that is so super sophisticated, so advanced, that it really only attracts the top 4,000 mathematicians in the world, we attract the top 4,000 mathematicians in the world, who otherwise you wouldn't get. So it's very important to exclude the people that you don't want, as well as be welcoming to the people that you do want. And in our case, we always do that by keeping the expert questions and showing how difficult and complicated our hardest questions, we keep those front and center to try and drive away the homework questions. This is just sort of another example of a typical group that there's just kind of a whole bunch of clues here. And this is one of the things I was saying about how a society, no matter how small, this is a group of 5 kids, right, playing some sport. I think it's Ultimate Frisbee. But you get a few clues here. By looking at this, first of all, you can tell that there's a couple of subtle things going on here. The kids are wearing shorts, but it's winter, which you can tell because there's no leaves on the trees. And it's Yale, which you can tell because it looks like Yale, and if you knew that. And the fact that they're wearing shorts in the winter tells you that they're from California. So the first thing you know is that they're Californians. This guy is wearing his hat backwards, so he's a frat boy. You can kind of tell that he belongs to a fraternity. They're playing Ultimate Frisbee, so that's what they're really into. If you're into Ultimate Frisbee and you want to play Ultimate Frisbee and you go to Yale, you're going to walk by and you're going to say, hey, I'm going to join you guys. If you're not into sports, if you're not from California, if you're not wearing shorts in the winter, then none of this will appeal to you and you'll just keep walking right on, which is as it was meant to be, and that's what we try to do with our home pages. Okay, second big thing that we have on Stack Overflow, and this is not that complicated, is the concept of voting. Of course, you've all seen it. You can vote for questions. So the good questions get a lot of votes, the bad questions get some downvotes. But even more importantly, you vote for answers. And the voting for answers is that's sort of the magic where Stack Overflow works, which is that you get 4 or 5 answers and the best ones come to the top, and people compete to write the best answer and to earn the most votes, because those votes translate into reputation that they get to keep. And so voting is a very, very simple mechanism that not very many other sites have, although a lot of them have started to introduce it. We stole it from Reddit, of course. But voting is actually really, really important in that it generates reputation, something we call reputation. And the idea of reputation is that it doesn't take a lot to motivate people online. And so you try to create a system that will motivate them to do the things that you want and that will unmotivate them or de-incentivize them or whatever to not do the things that you don't want them to do. And this was inspired by the military, which has these sort of crazy uniforms with what they call in the US military fruit salad that you wear here that shows all the amazing stuff that you've done when you're Colin Powell. And we copied that directly. So we have, these are our top users, and every user has like a little badge that shows up whenever they do something that has their picture if they choose it. It shows how much reputation they have. It shows how many badges they've earned. It shows what tags they're good at, where they're from, a bunch of other stuff like that. These user badges start out very simple. When you first create an account, you make up a name And if you're smart enough to come up with a name, then you get 1 point free. Actually, nobody has 0. And you start out with a very generic icon that represents you, which you can change anytime you want. But the nature of things is that it takes you a while to figure out that you can actually change that icon and to figure out how it's done. So all the newbies haven't changed their icon. They just get those little triangles. And once you figure out how to upload an icon, you start to look a little bit more like a respectable person. So it's very obvious from the way these 2 badges look that that second person has been on the site a little bit longer. He or she already has 208 reputation and has earned 6 badges and accepts 85% of the questions that he asks or she asks. And we don't show accept rate anymore because that was broken in various ways. Once you earn a lot of reputation, I think at 10,000 reputation, it's hard to see here, but you get a drop shadow beneath your avatar. And when you hover over that, you get a little card that you can use to talk about yourself and to advertise yourself more. Go into more detail there. Some people have a lot of reputation. Our #1 reputation user is John Skeet. And he starts to show up with lots and lots of badges. And when you see him answering a question, you know that he's cool. And the only other thing you can get besides that is you can get a little diamond that shows up next to your name. And the diamond means that you ran for an election and you got elected moderator. And a moderator has a lot more powers than even the most advanced user. And so the little diamond is like a little badge that you wear as a sheriff or a policeman or something to show that you have moderator capabilities. And for that, you have to win an election. I think there are currently 17 moderators on Stack Overflow. There are a few hundred moderators throughout the Stack Exchange network that have all won elections. Now, all this stuff that you're wearing on our site, that you're using to present yourself to the outside world, is, in World of Warcraft, it's called EPEEN. But the basic idea is stuff that you wear that shows the world how awesome you are. And people do that in regular life all the time. So I just took a picture of this guy, which I downloaded from Google, and I was just trying to count the number of messages that he's sending before he even left the house, the number of things that he's sending from a message. So he's wearing like the little Confederate flag on his hat. That's the southern states that separated from the United States in the Civil War in 1860. And we had to beat them into submission, but he's still got their flag on his hat. He's got a lot of tattoos that I don't even want to start to explain. He's got a particular kind of flip phone, a particular hairstyle. He has a Harley-Davidson motorcycle belt buckle. That's cool. His shirt is what we colloquially call a wife beater because of the people who wear them. It has some other names, but let's call it a wife. And he has not only is he wearing a wife beater, but he has an emergency backup wife beater here in case anything happens to the first wife beater. So essentially, and muscles, right? So the number of things this guy is doing to send you a message about who he thinks he is and how cool he thinks he is really like when you see the Shah of Iran, in portraits wearing the same thing. It's really no different than that. It's the same kind of thing. And on our site, one of the things that has been discovered about people's motivation is that you don't really have to care that much about what people think about you to be motivated by it. And in fact, if you think that even one person is going to notice and something that you do or something that you wear, that's enough motivation to wear that thing. And so, everybody sort of adjusts their clothing and the way they appear online, what their email address is, right? Like the tiniest representation of themselves online. People do care about that enormously. And if they believe that even one other person is going to notice that, then that's enough of a motivation. We have this whole system of badges on Stack Overflow, and there's dozens of them. And these badges are things that you earn for doing certain things on the site. Sharing a question, flagging a post, rolling back things. The reason we created these badges is, first of all, it was fun. And secondly, we wanted you to feel like you were earning something, like you were playing a game on Stack Overflow. But also, the most important thing is it sends a message to everybody that participates in the site of what we want you to do and how we want you to behave. So for example, there is a badge, I think it's called Tumbleweed, that you get for responding to a question that was asked a very long time ago. And you might not know, gee, I wonder if it's a good idea to respond to this question. The original user is long gone. Should I even bother answering that question? They probably don't even have this problem anymore. Why would I bother answering a question from a year ago? And what we know at Stack Overflow is that the questions are not there for the person who asked them. There was only one person who asked the question. But 1,000 people are going to type the same question into Google and land on this page in the future. So it's very important for us to gather answers, even to very old questions, where the original questioner is long since lost. Because bizarrely, I don't care about the person who asked the original question. They drive me crazy. I don't need them. What I care about is the 1,000 people that view the average question on our site. And those people are the majority of our audience, and those people are who I'm trying to serve. And so we create these badges where we try to incentivize you to do things to make the site better for the majority of the users who come along later. And by creating that badge, we can send a signal to everybody that we care about your answering old questions. And if you ever wondered, am I allowed to answer my own question? Sure, there's even a badge for it. And that proves that we encourage you to answer your own question. And answering your own question is important because sometimes just typing the question makes you realize the answer, and then you type the answer, and you just made the internet that much better. And that's awesome, and we want you to do that. We don't think you're wasting our time if you ask a question, come back 10 minutes later and answer it yourself. That's awesome. And so the badges enforce that on the sociology. You might imagine a site where we didn't have that badge, and somebody wrote a question, they figured out the answer themselves, and then they answered it themselves. And then somebody said, you idiot, why did you answer your own question? Now I can't earn a reputation for it. It's not fair. And you could imagine such a world, and that's not the world that we wanted to create, because then nobody wants to answer their own question, and these things languish unanswered. And that doesn't help anybody. So the very complicated system of reputation and badges that exists to steer and shape the community into doing the things that we want them to do to make the site successful. And all of that reputation, of course, translates into this website that we have called Careers 2.0, where you can go and get a job using your Stack Overflow reputation. So you can say, I'm awesome at Java, and I live in Lisbon, and if somebody's hiring Java programmers in Lisbon, you can search for me. An employer can search for you and find you. Okay, another thing every society has, and one more thing I learned from cultural anthropology, is some form of government. And there's some kind of system that you use to keep people civilized. Our system, we start with the reputation, and as you earn more reputation points, you start to be deputized with various powers. You start to gain the privilege of doing things. So at the very lowest level, you start to be able to put comments and vote and stuff like that. At a higher level of reputation, you can start voting things down. At an even higher level of reputation, you can vote to close questions that you think don't belong on the site. And so almost all of the moderation on Stack Overflow is actually being done by regular users. Almost all of the police work and the maintenance. We get 7,000 questions a day, sometimes more, and it's increasing. With 7,000 questions a day, there's no way we can police it all. And so the users themselves have to police it. And so as you earn more reputation, you earn those rights to police things. Every version of government has to have a Congress or a parliament or someplace where people assemble. For us, it's a site called Meta Stack Overflow. It's the site where we talk about Stack Overflow. You'll find on Meta Stack Overflow, maybe 10% of our active users have even heard of meta.stack overflow. And they go on there and they discuss how the site should work and what improvements should be made and things that are going on. Now, 1% of our users have discovered that we have chat rooms, that we actually have online 24-hour chat rooms. This is a secret chat room called Teachers Lounge. Only the moderators participate in this, and it's a real-time, 24/7 conversation about moderating. So if somebody is misbehaving on the site, or somebody is DDoSing us, or somebody's trying to attack us in some way, or somebody's behaving very badly, or somebody's having a mental breakdown, think about it this way. We get 7,000 questions a day. About 1% of the people on the planet are psychotic. That means that we get, did I get this right, 70 questions a day from psychotic people. So there's a lot of moderation work to be done here. And this is discussed live in Teachers Lounge. People having, every possible form of mental breakdown happens at least once a week on our site. A good government has some forms of communicating with people. And that's our blog. And it's the place where we say, hey, we just did this new thing. We're changing this. And we're thinking about this. And every good form of government creates laws. So we actually have a system of laws and rules which were mostly quote-unquote democratic, meaning we provided people with some initial guidance, but over time, we let the community figure out what rules we want to have about Stack Overflow. When we created it, we actually thought all questions would be allowed. At some point we thought, it's just going to be questions about technology, IT, programming, systems administration. And very quickly we realized there are only going to be programming questions. This is all about typing code. It's only programming, very specifically. So even what was allowed on the site was something that was defined by our own community and our own users. We have one very specific rule for Stack Overflow, which is we hate fun. Anything funny, humorous, entertaining is probably a really bad sign. It's probably not useful and it's probably a waste of time. Remember, we're trying to serve the people that are typing a question into Google and finding their answer on Stack Overflow. And for those people, the faster they get the answer, the happier they are. And anything that is like a joke or just being friendly or anything like that just gets in the way of people getting their answer as quickly as possible. And so one thing that makes us really, really suspicious is when we see a post on Stack Overflow that has a lot of page views. That's almost always a sign that there's something wrong here. It's too popular. Got to be something wrong here. Because we are, we're the long tail of programming knowledge. We're not, the C programming manual. We are the, how do I do this one very, very detailed and very, very convoluted thing? That's what we're all about. And if we see something that's getting a lot of questions, there is probably something going wrong there. We do not want to just be all about the most popular questions on the internet. We don't even want to have popular questions. If you do that, you become Reddit or Dig. If you were to have a site that consisted only of popular things, you would end up with a website that consisted entirely of pictures of like cats falling into toilets and dogs rescuing other dogs from the swimming pool and all that kind of stuff. So that stuff is really popular, and there's a million places to find it on the internet. Not our problem, and it's not what we want to have. So one of the ways that we enforce our laws is through closing a question. This is sort of misunderstood a little bit. Closing a question, we're not deleting it. We keep it around. It's just marked closed, and you can't answer it. And the reason we keep it around is sort of like the person who commits a crime, and you cut off his head, and you put it in the center of the city on a stick. So everybody can see, don't do this. This is bad. We will make a bad example out of you, and we will show everybody the shame of the awful thing that you did on our site, so that everybody knows not to do that, instead of just hiding it, sweeping it under the rug. Right now we have, these are going to change, by the way, because we got them a little bit wrong, but right now we have 5 main reasons why we will close a question. 5 key reasons which I'll go into. Exact duplicate, question's been asked before. Off topic, right? Like you're asking about, driving a car, and this is a site about programming. Not constructive, it's very difficult to understand. I'll explain it in a minute. Not a real question, also not well understood. Too localized, which in our terminology means this question is a little bit too specific. So here's some examples of some of those reasons. This is a duplicate where somebody says, can you explain monads to me? And we already have somebody explaining monads somewhere else. And because Stack Overflow is a wiki where everything can be edited, I would rather have all eyeballs on the same explanation of monads rather than having some people over here and some people over there, because then that one question gets better and better and better over time. And so when we close something as duplicate, we keep both questions, but we sort of merge the answers, essentially. We say, go over here because the answer is already there. So that's a duplicate, very non-controversial. This is an example of off-topic. Sometimes it's not obvious. Toilet issue in my company. Not strictly a programming problem, but any help will be appreciated. I have a lady employee who is joining from tomorrow, and I want to convey her a message that the bathroom facilities at the office are out of order. How do I tell her to relieve herself before arriving in the morning? Sideways smiley face. So this is a wonderful problem to have, but it has nothing to do with programming, and it serves no purpose. Closed. Again, why are we closing this? It's not hurting. We're not running out of bits on the internet. And we still got storage space on our hard disks. The reason we're closing this is because if this ever gets on the homepage, God forbid, of our website, then somebody is going to think that we're a website where you can ask questions about toilet issues. But it's all about making that homepage attract the right people and detract the wrong people, like Zahid Sattar, who asked this question. When we say not constructive, closed as not constructive, it's not good terminology, but and we're going to change the terminology. But what it really means is this is a conversational, subjective opinion question. Should I use Web Forms Developer or MVC Developer? Which is better, Oracle or SQL Server? Should I use Emacs or VI? Should I use tabs or spaces? All this kind of stuff just generates heat and generates no knowledge. Anything that's going to create a lot of endless conversation that can go back and forth, anything where everybody has an opinion and everybody can weigh in with an answer, anything where it's hard to tell the difference between a good answer and a bad answer, anything where all answers are equally valid, is not for us. We're trying to be fact-based. We're trying to use very, very specific answers to very specific questions. We're not trying to make a place where you can have conversation. So if you came here and you thought it would be fun to have a conversation, go somewhere else. There's a lot of places like that on the internet. Here's another example. Need ideas about mobile apps, Android, iPhone, which have never been created before. So somebody just came on here and said, hey, give me some ideas. I want to make an app. Again, we call this not a real question, but this is, again, it's a bid for a conversation, and it's fine on a forum, but we're all about questions and answers, so we consider that to be off topic. Now, too localized. This is an interesting one. I'm missing a bracket somewhere. Here's my code. Debug it for me. But by localized, we mean that your question occupies such a vanishingly small part of the world that we just don't care. We just don't care about it. And an example might be, why is there a green car parked in front of my house? I don't know. Is it still there? Go check. Does it really matter? I don't live next to your house. Nobody cares. Leave us alone. So this is what's interesting about this is that in 5 seconds, this could be converted to a great question. The way to convert this to a great question is, I have some code that looks like this. Here's 5 lines of my code. And I'm getting an error that says that I'm missing a bracket. How should I debug this? What's the first step I should take in debugging this? That's a great question, because it has a real answer. And you'll get that answer, and it'll be extremely useful. And everybody who's missing a bracket will say, I'm missing a bracket. How do I debug it? And they're going to find that page, and it's going to be helpful to them. But here, somebody's going to say, oh, it's on line 29. That's useless. Why make this artifact for the world? We're not your debugger. So that's essentially, those are some of the examples, I think, of ways where we very deliberately crafted the way that the software works in an effort to get people to behave in a certain way, because we wanted them to accidentally create this amazing artifact as a byproduct of asking questions and answers. We wanted them to create this amazing index of questions and answers, which we have like 4 million questions and answers that are available for the whole programming world to dive into. And essentially, we've now created such a large world on Stack Overflow. There's so many people there. They're asking so many questions. They're doing so many things. They're moderating. They're in the chat rooms. That it's like a large city. It's actually, it's bigger than a large city. And you can imagine in a city, there's going to be all kinds of corners that are clean and all kinds of corners that are dirty and places that are scary and places that are exciting. There's going to be different cultures. People are probably all mostly speaking the same language, but they might have very different dialects of that language. And there's just going to be this enormous world of complicated stuff going on. And when I started in computer science, and when I learned computer science, and a lot of the stuff that's still taught in certain universities as computer science or software engineering, is really about making a 1950s computer perform a calculation. And actually, what we're building today and what we do today, especially on sites like Stack Overflow, because of the internet, because that changed everything, is we're creating societies, and we're actually creating cultures. And the way to think about that is from an anthropological perspective. Thank you very much. So I have, I was going to ask the organizers if I have time for questions. Maybe? No one? No time? I guess I do.
Hello. I have a question. When you first created the website, when there was still no knowledge about it, when there was still no community formed at all, how did you create that incentive that you said about keeping the homepage interesting for the people who interesting, when there was still no people visiting there, creating the questions that would interest the other experts to go there.
Yeah.
How did you?
How do we? That's sort of like a question of how do you start this thing from zero? How do you get from zero to? We discovered that it takes 200 people to make a site like this work. If you have anywhere between 0 and 199 people, the site will die instantly. Every time somebody asks a question, nobody will answer it. The answer is that we cheated. We started the site in 2008. So in 2008, I went backwards in time to 2000 and started writing a blog called Joel on Software, and got a lot of readers who were programmers around the world to start reading that blog. And so in 2008, when I wrote on Joel on Software, hey, I just made a website called Stack Overflow, go check it out, we got 30,000 people on the first day. So, but that was an audience that took me 8 years to build. And so that's the secret, essentially. I don't know of any way without, I mean, this is a problem that every new site has to face, depending on how large of a critical mass you need. One thing, another way to solve this problem, to address this, is to think about, can I make a site that's useful to one person? Can I make an application that is valuable to the very, very, very first person that uses it? But realistically, we just sort of cheated by having a pre-existing audience. And I think without that, we wouldn't have been successful. So, like I said, go back in time 8 years, start building an audience, and then and that's how you'll do it. And we also, another interesting part about this is that this was sort of developed. It's a lot like lean startups, where you put something out there and you constantly iterate on it and change it. The day that we launched, we didn't even have comments. We just had questions and answers. There was no slot to put comments. And we realized very quickly that people wanted to put comments, and they would put them in answers because they didn't have a comment field. And that was broken because we wanted the answers to all be answers, not to actually be comments. And so we fixed that right away. But there's a lot of stuff where we tried to do it right the first time, and we just had to change it after it came out. So there was a lot of adjusting, especially in the early days. And we're still changing things. And the closed reasons that we have now are not perfect, and so we're going to change them a little bit. There's stuff that changes all the time. Any other questions?
Here. Hello. Could I ask you what is your creation you're most proud of in all this?
No. I love all my children.
Hello. I wanted to ask, is there any example of a feature that was in your website that you had to remove because of the way it was focusing the community?
Yes, there are a lot of examples of things that we removed because they weren't working the way we thought that they would. Some of them are small, some of them recently happened. We used to have this, okay, so we have a feature, this is the last thing that we removed, and this was like 2 weeks ago. We have a feature where you can accept the answer that solves your problem, but it's optional. And so the theory is you get 5 answers, you vote up all the ones that are good as a way of giving a little bit of currency to those people, but then you also accept the answer that actually solved your problem if one of them did, and sometimes they didn't and you couldn't accept one. And so we wanted to encourage people to accept more answers on the site, and in order to encourage them, we gave them a statistic called their accept rate, which we put next to their name, where it said 80% accept rate. That means that of the questions that you asked, you accepted 80% of them. And that was, it worked for a while, but then we saw this phenomenon where you would see somebody asking a question and they would have a low accept rate, like 60% accept rate. And sometimes that was legitimate because maybe just nobody answered their questions very well. And sometimes that wasn't legitimate. They should have gone back and accepted more answers. But what you would see is that people, instead of answering the question, would write a comment that said, I don't think I'm going to answer this because your accept rate is very low. If you had a higher accept rate, I would answer this. So we had this feature, and then if you actually looked, you saw that the questions from users with low accept rates were answered just as often as questions from users with high accept rates. In other words, people were going on the site and being snotty and nasty to each other, and they weren't even changing their behavior. It was just an excuse. This whole feature had accidentally became an excuse to be rude. And so we just removed it because it wasn't incentivizing the behavior that we wanted, and it was creating an unnecessary behavior in which people were being nasty to each other. And so we removed it. And in that case, I don't think it was a mistake. The first year of having this feature was enough to educate people that we want them to accept answers. But we then removed it because we don't want them playing the game of how can I accept the most number of answers. That's just one example. We remove things all the time, and we change things all the time, and nothing is ever really cast in stone. Any other questions? Right here.
Hi, Joe. I have a question.
Paul.
So I imagine you collect metrics to do all these kinds of analysis. Do you have some kind of data analytics that you run just by side
Yes.
of your software? What kind of thing do you use?
Everything. Okay, so we got tons and tons and tons of analytics. We have, first of all, there's a lot of visible analytics. So when you look at a question, all the stats about that question are actually shown on the question. How many people viewed it, how many people asked it, how many people did everything is shown up there in the upper right-hand corner. All your personal analytics, like what have I done, how many questions have I answered, what are they? You can go onto the user page, and we have like 12 tabs there full of all kinds of interesting analytics. And people actually care about some of that. They're like, I wonder what day I earned the most reputation between 11 p.m. and midnight. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, especially people watching their reputation very closely, that kind of analytics. We have moderator tools where we give people a dump. We watch it by using Google Analytics to track traffic. And we have moderator tools where we use the Google API to slice and dice all the Google Analytics and make it available to all our moderators so that they can track traffic, questions, answers, page views, like just about everything you want to measure. We have Mixpanel doing A/B tests all over the place. So every time we're about to roll out a new feature, we'll A/B test like 17 different versions of it. Right now the login page is changing a lot because we're A/B testing different things to try to get more people to sign up on the sign up page. And then finally, all of this stuff is we capture every single thing we can think of and throw it in the database. And a lot of that stuff is in our open source, publicly available version of our database, which is available in two forms. There's a version online that you can just type SQL queries at if you ever want to query anything from Stack Overflow to figure stuff out. And that has been a rich source of academic knowledge. Actually, a lot of people at different universities have queried our database to try to learn things. And we also make a complete database dump available as a SQL backup that anybody can take. We strip out private information, and everything else is publicly available. So I'll take one more question.
Just a little twist on the first question. I didn't get the mic in time at that time. I understand the way that you started with the programming, but what about the Jewish and the mathematics? And did you had to hire moderators, for specific Jewish questions?
No, what we did, the history behind that, we started with programming, and then we got the idea. We made the second thing we made was server fault, which we made ourselves for system administration questions, and the third thing was super user for power users of computers, PCs, Windows, and stuff like that. And once we had those three, we pretty much had the IT field covered, we thought. But the first attempt we made, which was a complete failure, was we tried to become a software company. And we essentially said, if you want to buy the Stack Overflow software, pay us, we'll run it for you on our servers. So it's software as a service. And you can make any kind of community you want. And what we discovered is several hundred communities got created, and only one of them got any kind of audience at all. 5 of them got some audience. One of them was Math Overflow, which was very successful. Most of them were just failures because the people that created them didn't have that critical mass of 200 people to answer questions. They just didn't have any way of recruiting enough people to them. And so the second decision that we made was we said, hey, wait a minute. Instead of saying, why don't you guys make your own sites, let's ask our existing users, the programmers, what else those people want to talk about. Because we have a group of people that we know are already participating in our site. So what we've built is something called Area 51, and it's a place where you can go on Area 51 and you propose a new topic that doesn't already exist for a Stack Exchange, and you have to get a bunch of people to come agree that site should be created, and we gather votes, and once you get enough people so that we know that the site will work, then we open it up. But the site will wait in Area 51 until we get, like I said, 200 good users that are willing to commit to it, usually. So that's good. So one last question.
Sorry, this could have a potential to become a bit long, but I wanted to ask your opinion on Jeff Atwood's next project, Discourse, exactly. Yeah. It also has the potential to change the way people use discussion forums online. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so Jeff Atwood was my co-founder at Stack Overflow, and he left the company about a year ago to do a new project. And his new project is called Discourse, and Discourse, the idea there is to take all the things that we don't like on Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange and make software that can handle them really well. So we've just spent the last 4 years telling people that they shouldn't have conversations, and they shouldn't essentially, and that those are inappropriate for a question and answer forum. But there is an enormous space available for people to ask, to have conversations, to have online conversations. And you see these forums all over the internet, and they're the sort of the successors of BBSs and of Usenet and online forums. And most of them are running terrible software right now. And so he's created very new, modern, awesome Ruby software that's got all the cool, latest hot stuff like automatic page filling as you scroll down and all that kind of stuff. And the goal there is to fill in the other gap that Stack Exchange doesn't fill in of everything besides questions and answers. Actually, when I started Stack Overflow, the reason I realized it's not a forum, it's questions and answers, is because I looked at Usenet and I saw that more than half of what was happening on Usenet, the first item in the thread was always a question, and then there were a bunch of answers. And the other half was just random conversation, but it was almost always question and answer. It was very frequently question and answer based. So essentially, he's kind of taken the big hole that we left behind in Stack Exchange and built some new software for doing it. And he's doing it in a slightly different way. It's just going to be open source like WordPress, as opposed to sort of like a company single site kind of thing that anybody can put on their own site, again, modeled on WordPress. Okay, so I'm out of time for questions, but I'm going to hang out here for another 15 minutes or so. Feel free to come down and ask me if you have anything personally you want to talk about. I'll be here. Thank you.